Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Lots going on at Red Bull. The team successfully convinced Max Verstappen to stay with the outfit going into next year, and now they finally have a positive trajectory given the results in recent rounds. But 2026 is what really matters, and Pierre Wache says that next year's engine is actually going to be incredibly good compared to initial expectations. Where is it going to sit though, given that Max the other day thinks that Mercedes is going to have the strongest engine next year? And does he still really trust Pierre Wache at the top of the Red Bull technical department, because his father Jos seems to have lost any of that trust over the last couple of years? Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. This was Oscar Piastri and an old Senna McLaren at the McLaren Technology Centre as they continue to celebrate their World Championship. A couple of big updates around F1. Firstly, Colapinto, we talked about him yesterday, that based on performances in recent rounds, he is definitely increasing his chances to stay in the sport. Apparently, an announcement is expected. If he does get the announcement, I think that it will be a deserved one. Look, over the last few rounds, Colapinto, among others, were under pressure. Certainly Tsunoda, for example. And while Tsunoda has obviously come nowhere near Max, you wouldn't expect that. But Yuki's done not much over the last 5 rounds to convince Red Bull that he should stay. Whereas I think Colapinto has definitely done enough to convince Alpine that extending his deal could be a good idea. Apparently that may well happen, and an announcement is expected in due course. There's also another thing I wanted to throw out there on James Vowles' ideas of running a 2-day Grand Prix weekend. Now, it wouldn't have been long ago this idea would have been considered wholly blasphemous. But I do see the logic in it. There's certainly pros and cons to this. Now, Vowles has raised this point mainly for the reason that the team is incredibly stretched at the moment. All of the teams, all of the staff. There are 24 Grand Prix now in a season, and each of those are 3-day weekends. And it's more than 3 days, right? Because Wednesday, a lot of the stuff arrives, even sometimes before that. Thursday is media day. Friday is practice or potentially qualifying for a sprint. Saturday is qualifying or a sprint. Sunday is race day. Then they've got to pack up, they've got to get out of there Monday, and sometimes they'll arrive in the next race on the Tuesday, and then I've got to do it all over again for the upcoming weekends. To such a degree now that many of the team members are taking rounds off. We've seen even some of the top guys, Toto Wolff among others, missing Grand Prix weekends, but also rotation of pit crew, rotation of mechanics and other staff at the track, that it becomes a serious challenge to manage. And also, for the drivers, they arguably have it easier than lots of the crew because they just get in the car and drive, and they also do other things too, but the team has to be there all the time, all weekends. And the teams are definitely struggling with this to a degree. But we know that F1 will not back down on 24 races. We're not going to go from 24 to fewer. It's just very, very unlikely to happen in the commercial interest of the owners of the sport. So if anything, they want to pump that number up beyond 24. Domenicali will be thinking, well, as far as I know, there's 52 weekends a year, so what are we doing, right? So the argument is, could we, for the betterment of the, well, first of all, mainly the staff in the sport, but also maybe from a viewer perspective as well, go for a 2-day weekend? So drop the Friday. This would also mean dropping sprints as well, right? That would be the implication here, is that the Saturday would just be qualifying day, and then Sunday would just be race day, and presumably it would be Saturday morning, you get 1 free practice session, Saturday afternoon, qualifying, Sunday is the race. That means that media day would be Friday, it saves everyone a day. And there's lots of talk about this, even over the last couple of years. If you ask the drivers, do they really need 3 hours of practice? The engineers will say, yes, please, but also the engineers that are there at the track will say, well, maybe not, because it means I've got to be here an extra day if this was the actual proposal. The drivers don't really mind. They're okay with 1 hour of practice. I think it could be problematic for some of the rookies, right, getting up to speed, getting much less time to do so. I think there's also a debate on what it means for attendees of the track. Like, the Friday is a pretty chill atmosphere. A lot of people like to be there, but, at the same time, could they still sell plenty of tickets for those days? And Vowles effectively says, if we just did Saturday, Sunday, maybe we could even do more race weekends. We could even do a few more if you wanted to. So, don't know what you guys think about that. I don't think many people really want to see or massively desire more races. Like 24 is already quite a lot. But I do understand that there's lots of fans that, especially on the days where there is free practice, that they won't necessarily watch. They'll see the results, maybe they'll tune in for a bit if they feel like it, but it's qualifying and it's race day that people mainly watch. So I can understand the logic in just narrowing it down to that. if it could be better for other parties. So I don't say I want to see this exactly, but I'm not entirely against it if it's done in the right way. So intrigued to your thoughts on that. This is pretty funny. The last couple of days we've talked about Carlos Sainz and his frustrations with the broadcasting in F1. Now, I know that Kim Illman did a video and he said that actually during Singapore there was only like 15 or 20 seconds of girlfriends being shown. And it's like, well, yes, but that's not entirely the point, right? Like, the point is, what Sainz was saying about the girlfriend is not necessarily just because, oh, the girlfriends are on the screen too much. That's like the headline. But what he's really saying is that the race directors just don't do a good enough job showing what actually matters on the track, right? I mean, the amount of times we watch Lando just trailing behind Max in his dirty air when you know nothing's going to happen. So, like, what's the point? There's battles happening further down the field, and, you know, they want to focus on the championship contenders. I get that, but there's got to be a better balance there. And it's also not just the girlfriends and the family or whatever, it's also shots of the crowd or shots of an overview of the track or something like that, right? When there's actual on-track action happening that was missed. So, you know, I think people are taking it a little bit in a different way. But it's pretty funny that they put a Sainz iconic onboards video out just a couple of days after there was a little bit of drama. Now, I also wanted to go through this. So, Piastri, Norris, they are, on paper, the title contenders. But there is also another conversation to be had there. We did have this conversation before Singapore. I think now it's, well, even more relevant, potentially, because Max continues to close in on Oscar Piastri's championship lead. But it's also very clear that with what happened in Singapore, they certainly are not favouring Oscar. Whether you think they are inherently biased towards Lando is a different conversation, but they're certainly not favouring Oscar in this title battle. But there is an argument that they should. Even Günther Steiner was like, well, look, with Max clipping at the heels, yeah, they've won the constructors, congrats. But it's not a total guarantee that they won the drivers. So you could argue that McLaren, given Piastri has a 22-point title lead, they should favour him and basically ensure that Max doesn't win the title in attempt. But of course, to favour Piastri means to sacrifice Lando, and Lando's not going to do that of his own volition, right? So it's easy to say on paper, okay, favour Piastri, and look, they could, from like a strategic perspective, go down that route, but it's also not in, you know, the spirit of papaya or whatever, but it would be, I think some people would consider it kind of poetic if somehow Max comes from nowhere and wins this title and takes it away from both of the McLaren drivers, especially when there would be an argument from, let's say, Mark Webber to say, hey, Oscar's in the lead, they should give him the benefit of the doubt. But then Lando will say, well, if it wasn't for that DNF in Zandvoort, then the title would basically be absolutely neck and neck. But then Oscar would say, well, if it wasn't for Monza, you know, it is the situation, unfortunately, for McLaren that they have put themselves into. But Andrea Stella admits this outright. I think this is why it's a more interesting conversation, is because Andrea Stella is refusing to dismiss the Verstappen threat. He's actually very clear that Red Bull are very capable, they're definitely in the game, Max is absolutely a championship threat, they've said that multiple times, so if McLaren are going to outright admit that Max is a serious championship threat, then it gives credence to the idea that maybe they have to think about how they manage their drivers. They won't, but it is an argument that could well be made, and even Ralf Schumacher says this, and it's like, look, you guys got to be careful at McLaren, because if there's a collision that happens, I mean, he believes that it's plausible that a collision between the two, Piastri and Norris, again is inevitable based on what has recently happened, and I wouldn't entirely disagree with that assessment. And of course, with Max continuing to close the gap, it is absolutely possible that becomes an issue. Now, speaking of Max and Red Bull, we're going to get into that because Christian Horner has been very much in the news over the last couple of days after his dismissal from Red Bull recently. This is an interesting one. So, Horner wants back into Formula One. Nobody is denying that. There's rumours that maybe Aston Martin aren't interested. He spoke to Haas. That wasn't going to work out. There's talk about Ferrari. There's also talk about Horner coming in as Horner Racing, which is kind of what Red Bull was, but Red Bull Racing. But anyway, literally coming in as his own team. He's got backers, he's got support. They could do it. Now, there would be two ways to do that. You would either create a brand new team as a 12th entry and try and get accepted. That would be a serious challenge. It's possible. There's definitely interest, like the FIA would want it. Formula One might even be interested, but they'd have to get the appropriate backing from the right manufacturer, right? The right OEMs, as it were. They'd have to pay a load of money as a dilution fee to the other teams. So that's kind of complicated. The easier approach would simply be, to be by a team, right? There was rumours about Alpine could be up for sale, but also the Red Bull sister team is something that's interesting. And apparently there has been an offer of $2.3 billion from investors. Not necessarily Christian Horner and his boys, but there is interest in buying the sister Red Bull team. Imagine a world where Red Bull sold Racing Bulls, AlphaTauri, Toro Rosso, whatever you want to say, to Horner, and then he makes that his own team. Could be very interesting. That's a lot of money, right? A couple of years ago, this would have been considered like, oh my god, teams are getting valued now in the billions? Well, the answer is yes. The most valuable teams, McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes, they're valued in the $5 billion range, right? And clearly Red Bull feel that Racing Bulls is, if it's worth $2.3 billion now, they think it may well be worth more than that in the future, and they might not be wrong on that assessment. Now, this is where Horner is also relevant, because there was talk about the Ferrari share prices going down over the last couple of days. And while that's not with respect massively to their Formula One project, or really at all, it is also undeniable that Horner's commercial savvy, shall we say, is very much up there. And if Horner was to, let's say, join Ferrari and be given a load of power and a load of control, maybe he would be able to have some serious impact on the financial success of that organisation. Do I think it's going to happen? I think it's a little doubtful. There's been lots of talk in the Italian press to say that, hang on a second, John Alcan, you just gave Fred Vasseur your vote of confidence 3 months ago. Now you're going to sack him? Like, what's going on there? It doesn't really sound like a good plan. I still don't think Vasseur's going to get sacked, but, he definitely is walking a tightrope right now, and the top Ferrari guys keep on saying, we've got to win, we are going to win for the fans, etc., etc., but nothing is changing as yet. Next year, of course, will be critical. Now, the Fred Vasseur, Christian Horner talk has gathered further steam, because Horner's severance from Red Bull, 80 million euros, apparently he's also going to settle the harassment case for a seven-figure settlement. I still think there's some more legal charges on that one, but presumably Horner will take a lot of money from that payout and, just pay off whoever needs paying out to get rid of that lawsuit. Then he can just come back into F1. So whatever you think about that, it's probably what's going to happen on current evidence. Then there's a gardening leave period, but pretty much mid-2026, we think that he could return. But certainly you can't sack Vasseur right now, because you wouldn't have a viable replacement for at least another 7 or 8 or so months. But Red Bull 2026, that's a serious question, especially with where Max Verstappen goes. He may not win this year's title. He's certainly not favoured to win it by any means, He's got a big comeback that he still needs to make, but credit to Max for at least keeping himself in the fight, but also to Red Bull. Max was even giving comments on whether this RB21 was really that bad at the start of the season, and as far as he believes, Max, there was more potential in that RB21 that could have been extracted earlier in the year if they'd understood what they understand now. Now, yes, have they brought upgrades? Have they made progress? Absolutely, yes. But also, there was more in that car, right? The RB21 was better than it appeared for a large part of the season. And if Red Bull realised that earlier and realised what they needed to do with setup and some of the things they've learned as the season has gone on, with potentially McKees has had a part to play in that as well, with changing the mentality of the organisation. But whoever's to blame or whoever deserves the praise for it, they've made progress. And if that had happened earlier, Max may well have won this championship. He may still win it, but it seems particularly unlikely. But it does feel that Red Bull are giving this year their best shot for Max, and then next year they're not expecting that much. I mean, even McKees has said it. They know that they are making serious sacrifices to next year's car by putting so much work into developing this year's. They think that's a trade-off worthwhile. But we know that next year, the engine is going to be massively important. You can have phenomenal aero next year. To be fair, the Red Bull back in 2014, and even, the couple of years after that, when it was the Renault engine, of course, the aero of that Red Bull under Newey was pretty good. It may not quite have been as good as the Mercedes, but it was still up there. Just their engine was terrible, right? So this is the thing. Red Bull probably know that they can put a lot of work into next year's aero, but if their engine isn't up to scratch, then it's probably not going to massively matter anyway. But also next year is super critical for Red Bull to keep hold of Max, because if next year isn't good for Red Bull, Is Max going to have much faith they're going to turn it around, especially if there's a seat maybe available at Mercedes? And frankly, if Max Verstappen is interested, there might well be a seat available practically anywhere he might be interested, right? So Carlos Sainz says, now he's driving for Williams, so he's obviously going to gas up the Mercedes engine, but he implies obviously the next year's going to be pretty good. Max the other day, just before we get into this quote, said that I do believe Mercedes will be at the front. They're a top company, especially when it comes to the engine. I do believe they'll be in the front. And Max believes that Red Bull are not going to have the quickest car next year. But Pierre Wache says that things are looking good. So this is interesting because Horner, Marco to some extent, but certainly McKees, they have been on the line of, well, you know, next year we're going to try our best, but it's a big challenge and we're probably not expecting to be the best. Horner and even others more recently have said it, that next year's engine, it would be embarrassing for Mercedes if they were as bad as us, is kind of the implication there. On the aero side, who knows, but we know that they are making some sacrifices for what's happening this year. We also know that Pierre Wache, who's making these comments, is held in questionable regard by the Verstappen camp. This has been a known thing for some time, and I think understandably so. Ever since Newey's departure, they've had issues with that Red Bull, and until very recently, they've been practically unable to solve them. Now, does Wache deserve credit for the recent turnaround? I'm sure that to a certain extent he does. But maybe Jos Verstappen would argue that if it wasn't for this guy, then they'd have had a better car this year anyway, and they'd have won the championship with Max again. So Wache's comments have to be held in, you know, a bit of a purgatory, as it were, because I don't know how much Max or his camp really trusts this guy to have the finger on the pulse. But he does say, with regard to the power unit, it's difficult to say, but it looks very, very promising. On the car, there are new aero regs. It's difficult to say. There's a lot to find. Difficult to know what the others will find, of course, which is always the key point. It's a relative game. He goes on to say a few things. It's important for next year, for that aspect, that we continue to develop everything we understand, even in a different reg, in terms of characteristics, in terms of the driver needs, and Yuki. It'll be the same problem, but maybe not for Yuki. We'll see about that. But yeah, he talks about a few things, but the interesting observation is that he believes the power unit is very, very promising. So where is he getting that assessment from? Clearly they're running some tests. The engine is there. There were rumours that the Red Bull engine for next year is actually quite powerful, but it's maybe not the most reliable, and they'd probably prefer that, right? It's better to have a car, as Horner said at the start of 2022, that breaks down sometimes but is very quick. But is it going to be too unreliable? And also, how can you tell? I think that's also the challenge. It's also true for Mercedes, for Ferrari, for Honda, for Audi, right? For the other engine manufacturers. But how can you tell where you are, right? Like, Red Bull have set their own targets, presumably internally. Maybe they're hitting those targets. Maybe that's what Wache considers very, very promising. But, you know, what if Mercedes targets are 10% better? Then it's not very promising compared to that. So it's interesting from Wache. Maybe there are rumours from other teams circulating behind the scenes as to, well, this team's looking at this kind of power output, this team's looking at this kind of power output. So maybe Red Bull actually do have reason to be confident. And look, if their power unit project is actually really good, it will be incredibly impressive what they've accomplished there. But it's still pretty unlikely that they do it. So tweet to your thoughts in the comments below. At the end of the day, whatever Wache says, what matters is what car they give Max next year. And if it isn't good enough, then Toto Wolff will, as ever, be on the phone. So tweet to your thoughts in the comment section below. Just one final thing. COTA is this weekend. George Russell won the Singapore Grand Prix. It was hot in Singapore. Hot in a slightly different way, obviously very humid, but also just hot straight up. Given the Mercedes intolerance of hot temperatures over the last couple of years, that to some extent was a surprise. Austin has been a pretty decent track for Mercedes over the last couple of years, but it also is expected to be very toasty indeed this upcoming weekend. So we'll see if that plays to Mercedes' strengths or not. Maybe Singapore is a bit of a turning of the corner. So very much intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.